My top priority when I first got to the National ACLU, I thought was going to be racial justice.
Mr. Ira Glasser, head of the American Civil Liberties Union. What years?
78 to 2001.
Throughout its existence, the American Civil Liberties Union has defended unpopular causes.
Actually, my top priority turned out to be organizational survival.
American Nazi Party leader Frank Collin has been trying to hold a march through the streets of Skokie, Illinois.
The ACLU is supposed to defend the free speech of Nazis.
The reaction of the Holocaust survivors was very understandable.
It brought up all our pains, all our losses of the families.
We can do it. This is only the beginning.
You would defend it again today if you had to?
Yes. The First Amendment is what permits people to organize for social justice goals.
Surely Charlottesville is a lot like Skokie.
White supremacists were looking for a way to flex their muscles.
It highlighted the issue of why would you ever want to defend the rights of people like that?
We cannot forget history. We cannot forget what our leaders, our mentors, and champions did for society.
The tide of liberty and individual rights and equal justice is clearly with us, but only if we keep swimming.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. The Cloward Piven strategy, as it's come to be known, was a political strategy born in the turmoil of the civil rights and Black power movements of the 1960s. It was designed to bring about a national solution to poverty in the country. First outlined in 1966 by American sociologists and political activists Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven, the hope was that civil rights organizations, militant anti-poverty groups, the poor and their allies would create a sufficient disruption to force reforms in the American income support system. Recruiting and mobilizing the poor onto welfare rolls would create a political crisis that could result in legislation in the form of a national guaranteed annual income, a redistribution of income that would bring an end to poverty. But there was profound political, cultural, and economic resistance and blowback to their narrative. The belief that poverty would be overcome through individual effort, personality, and character, rather than economic structural transformation, has deep roots in the country. Rather than analyzing how a capitalistic market system creates and regulates the poor and labor force and uses them as racial and economic scapegoats to divide and conquer, the poor are continually depicted in moral terms as shiftless, undeserving, lazy, and promiscuous, responsible for their plight and unworthy of government largesse. Religious dogma, rooted in a nativist Protestant work ethic, contributes to the belief that the poor will always and forever be with us. Critics and right-wing ideologues like Glenn Beck charge that the strategy was actually designed to bring down American capitalism. Cloward and Piven would be fundamentally responsible for the unsustainability and possible collapse of our economic system. In 2011, he attacked Piven as the instigator of violent revolution, called her one of the 9 most dangerous people in the world, an enemy of the Constitution, and a secret dark force dictating former President Barack Obama's agenda. Our guests today on The Radical Imagination share a long and important struggle, a personal and activist history of commitment and passion for social justice, individual freedom, and civil liberties. They're living lessons in history on how that struggle is a long-term endeavor and battle. Francis Fox Piven is a distinguished professor of political science and social emeritus at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Among numerous awards and distinctions, she has served on the boards of the ACLU and the Democratic Socialists of America, was the vice president of the American Political Science Association and president of the American Sociological Association. She's widely known for the classic books co-authored with Richard Cloward, which include Poor People's Movements, Regulating the Poor, The Mean Season, The Attack on the Welfare State, Why Americans Don't Vote, The Breaking of the American Social Compact, and her most recent, Challenging Authority. Her work and activism, no doubt, has something to do with her own childhood as the daughter of impoverished Russian Jewish immigrants growing up in Jackson Heights, Queens. In May 2019, a New York Times article cited her as having become the intellectual guru of a new generation of activist progressives around the country, including the Sunrise Movement, Democratic Socialists of America, and AOC and the Squad. Ira Glasser joined the New York Civil Liberties Union as associate director in 1967, was its executive director from 1970 to 78, and was the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1978 to 2001. In 2001, a new Racial Justice Fellows Program was established by the ACLU in his name. He and his organizations became key supporters in many of the legal and political battles that the Cloward-Piven strategy brought to the struggle. He's also the subject of a terrific brand new 2020 documentary entitled Mighty Ira. His childhood memories of Ebbets Field with his beloved Brooklyn Dodgers and on the streets of East Flatbush, portrayed in the documentary, informed much of his later adult radical activism and belief in the importance of racial justice and free speech in a free society. So thank you both so very, very much for being on the Radical Imagination. It's just an honor and a blessing to have you both here. I know before the show, you both haven't seen each other personally, I guess, met each other, been together for 20 years now. So this is a wonderful reunion, and it's so wonderful to have you both here on the Radical Imagination. Thank you again.
Thank you. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to see Ira again.
Yes. Well, there he is. There he is. And
we're still here, friend.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So tell us a little how you both met and how your own childhood backgrounds on the streets of New York and elsewhere really informed your passion and activism.
I'm going to let you go first on that one, Ira.
You are? I was about to say the same thing to you, but okay. Well, you know, I knew Dick before I knew Fran. I first met Dick around a poker table. As you know, Dick was a legendary poker player, and I had heard about him for years because I was a kind of a teenage poker hotshot myself. And I was working as a teenager, waiting tables and washing dishes and stuff like that. And then later doing sort of more formal social work in a residential summer camp for blind and deafblind adults up in Spring Valley, New York. And the head of that agency was Irving Miller, who was a professor at what was then called the New York School of Social Work, and now the Columbia School of Social Work. And he was compulsive, not a very good, but a compulsive poker player, as was several of the other staff. And they invited me when I was about 18 or 19 to play in their games from time to time in the evening. And they went on for hours. And during these games, Irving would tell stories about his colleague at the New York School of Social Work, Richard Cloward, who he described as a criminologist and a sociologist, who was an indefatigable, unbeatable poker player. And then once in a while, Dick would come up and visit his friend and stay for a night or two, and we would always have a poker game. So I first met Dick facing off against this reputed master, and he was good, let me tell you. I used to feast on the other players in the game because most of them were not very good, and since we didn't make very much, if any, money, I think it was like $100 a summer, $250 a summer at its peak, in that place, which was a lot of money for a teenager then, but still, I never spent any of it because I always used to support myself through the poker games with my colleagues. Well, Dick put an end to that. He was, I learned a thing or two from him, and he would sit there in what I called this John Wayne pose, with his head back and a cigarette dangling from his mouth, said almost nothing, but just kept winning. And so that was my first meeting with Dick Cloward before I even knew what the ACLU was about, much less working there. All of that came later. And when I first went to work at the New York Civil Liberties Union, soon after I got there, Dick Cloward became a member of the board for a time. And that's how, we got to know each other more professionally and to begin collaboration on a wide range of civil liberties issues that ended up revolving around welfare programs and the rights to welfare and better ways of trying to get rid of poverty than with inadequate welfare payments to people. So that was the beginning of it. And then later, Fran and I got to know each other, and Fran was a member of the national board of the ACLU. And I later became director there.
And I nominated you.
What?
I nominated you.
You were the one who nominated me. I never even knew that. Yeah.
Really?
Now you
I don't think so. I never knew who nominated me.
I remember somebody, whoever was sharing the meeting.
It must have been Ed Ennis.
Nominating speech. And they interrupted me. They said I could only speak a sentence in my nominating remarks. So I said semicolon, and I went on.
That's right. That's right. The semicolon has rescued me from attempts to shorten what I was saying as well. Yes. Thanks God for the semicolon. Well, I know I don't think it's possible I knew and forgot, but I am not yet at the stage where I'm forgetting too much. So I'm not sure I ever knew who exactly it was who nominated me. The way it worked, Jim, the national board of the ACLU had 80 or 81 people on it, any 55 or 60 of whom attended any given meeting. So it was a big complicated deal, and I think there was a search committee. I knew that, and the search committee came up with 3 candidates, me and 2 other people, both of whom were members of the board, if you remember, Marvin Schachter and Monroe Friedman. And so I was running on the board for the board election against 2 members of the board. I think I remember the vote, the end of the vote was something like 62-13 or something, but I don't think I ever knew who actually put my name in nomination. So thank you. It changed my life and kept me up a lot at night.
And you did a very good job.
Right. That's so interesting how the course of history oftentimes revolves around these sorts of chance sort of encounters in a sense. So you took the ACLU to a place where it really grew enormously during the times of your administration, correctly?
American politics helped.
Yes.
Because American politics put civil liberties at issue, and also the change in American politics that was mainly due to the rise of the Black freedom movement, made issues like poverty understandable as civil liberties issues. So we can't take all of the credit for what happened.
No, you can't take credit for much of what happened. What I always said is that all you can take credit for is finding yourself in a spot where you have some leverage and responding to it in an honorable way. But you know, as you all know, I am not a lawyer, and people were always surprised to find that out because they associated the ACLU almost exclusively with litigation and lawyers. My background was as a mathematician, and if I had stayed being a mathematician, I never would have had the opportunity provided by being in the position I was in at the ACLU. But that was also due to the politics of the time. I was always more interested in and passionate about those kinds of issues. But growing up in the 50s, as I did, you know, whenever I talked about that to my parents or to counselors at school or you know, to advisors of any kind, there was never any jobs that took what I was interested in and made it into a vocation. And it was also, you know, the post-Sputnik era in the late 50s and early 60s. And if you were a boy, not a girl, but if you were a boy and you were good in math or science, you got relentlessly tracked into it. And I just kept getting A's in mathematics. I wasn't particularly interested in mathematics, but I was good at it. And I was, you know, and pretty soon I found myself in graduate school on a doctoral program in mathematics, and I didn't really want to be there. And you know, by 1960, when I finished up a master's degree and I was about to continue on for a PhD, I decided, you know, I can't do this. I have to go back to New York. And it being 1960. What the 60s became was beginning to bubble and boil. The various movements were beginning to show themselves. And so for somebody like me, it became possible to think, well, maybe I can find some way of working in this area. And I left graduate school and I left math and I came back to New York and I supported myself by teaching math at Queens College for a few years while I sort of navigated to try to find a position that was more in line with what I was interested in. And that put me on a path that ended at the ACLU. So it was very circumstantial and, right. You know, and to some extent, you know, accidental, but accidents happen and you got to stay alert to them and take advantage of them to move in the direction you want to move. Because if I had stayed where I was, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Absolutely. And Francis, how did your trajectory take place? What were you doing in 1960, let's say? How were you moving? You were working at Mobilization for Youth?
No, not yet. I went to Mobilization for Youth in 62 or 63. It was my first sort of professional job, you know, besides working as a sales girl and a waitress and in a nightclub in Chicago. But my first job of status was at Mobilization for Youth. And it was really, I knew Richard a little bit because he taught at the School of Social Work. And my first husband was a student at the School of Social Work, the Columbia School of Social Work, then the New York School of Social Work. Of course, I got to know Richard much better through Mobilization for Youth. I should say that, you know, there's something about a rising left movement that is so exhilarating and is so moving and is so inspiring. And that's what was going on in the 1960s. So, you know, I stumbled into it through Mobilization for Youth, but there are many different ways in which people could have connected with the movements of the 1960s because there was a kind of subculture, a kind of movement subculture, particularly strong in the New York area. Those
I was going to say that. Yeah.
those guys that Ira knew through the poker game, where he met Richard, those guys were part of that kind of subculture. And it was a particular slant, particular angle on that subculture because most of them were group workers. They were social workers who were group workers. Group workers are great. They're fine. They're not like the caseworkers.
And were community organizers as well? No,
community organizing came out of the 60s.
Out of group work, right?
Okay.
Came out of the 60s, and people started to call themselves community organizers, and a lot of people who heard that said, "What is that?" But at that moment, the early 1960s, a city like New York, at least in the low-income neighborhoods, the Black and brown neighborhoods, the city was alive. On a summer evening, a warm evening, the streets crackled with life and energy and people, and all of that was drawn into the movement actions that occurred in those years. You know, this Mobilization for Youth was a social work program, was funded by the federal government and the city government, was funded by the Ford Foundation.
Right.
But nevertheless, I mean, had all of these sort of very proper establishment ties. Nevertheless, it drew in people from impoverished neighborhoods, racial minorities, and this subculture of the left that was associated with group work and later community organization. So Mobilization for Youth, even though it was another social program, another federal program, nevertheless, it just bristled with life and energy and radical instincts. Now, one of the things that Richard and I discovered through our work with mobilization was the welfare system. We didn't really know a lot about it before mobilization and before the very sort of nitty-gritty empirical work that we did in connection with mobilization. But there were actual women, mothers, Black and brown, who were connected to different programs, outreach programs that mobilization had. And through accounts of their experience, we began to learn about the welfare system. And we began to learn about the welfare system in a way that was not taught in any classes or available in any textbooks. We learned that the welfare system regularly rejected applicants, no matter their condition, no matter their poverty. And this was it was striking and even shocking to us. And we created a little research project. We had little storefront service centers. Mobilization had opened these service centers. And we asked the people working in these service centers to ask the people from the street who came in to fill out these little cards, which in the little cards, they would just explain why they were there. And basically, they said, because they didn't have any money to pay the rent. They didn't have any money to buy shoes for the kids when school was starting. So, we collected our cards and then we said to ourselves, why don't they have money for shoes? And what did the social workers sitting on the wooden chairs in front of the wooden tables, what did they do about the fact that people didn't have money for shoes for their kids? Well,
why are they depressed?
They went to the welfare department with the woman, with the mother, and they got the woman on welfare. Well, that of course raised the question, why weren't they on welfare already? Because we were associated with the social work tradition, which said that the programs worked as they were supposed to work. But they didn't work as they were supposed to work. And it was out of that realization, that insight, that we developed the strategy to end poverty, which called for a massive mobilization of social workers and lawyers and organizers to get people the benefits to which they were entitled. And the reason that connected us to the ACLU, at first the New York Civil Liberties Union before the ACLU, the reason it connected us to the New York Civil Liberties Union is that we were proposing a kind of movement that demanded what people were already entitled to by law, by regulation, by propaganda. So that's how we got to know Ira, because Ira was the person we called when we were at a demonstration of welfare moms who were demanding that their application be dealt with, or were demanding that their request for a special needs grant be dealt with. And there's a demonstration, and you get into trouble when you demonstrate, especially in a welfare center at that time, especially. And you had to call somebody. We called Ira. We essentially called the New York Civil Liberties Union. And I have to say, the New York Civil Liberties Union was a great support for the early claims for entitlement under welfare law. And later, of course, the American Civil Liberties Union was also a very supportive organization.
So Ira, you heard from Fran and Dick, and what were some of the early cases you remember and recall? And
well, it's really interesting. We were talking before about how you almost have to be in the right position, and some of the way some of us got drawn in to these movements were by being at a place where we learned things that we had never learned in school, that we didn't know about. When I first came to the New York Civil Liberties Union, there were 3 or 4 lawyers on staff. It was a small organization, but it was the largest legal staff in the ACLU at the time. These 3 or 4 lawyers did not go to law school to become civil liberties lawyers. They went to law school to work in corporate law firms. One of them was working in estates and trusts doing testamentary work. One of them was working in banking law. They were all working for white shoe law firms. And so you couldn't go to law school in those days to become a civil rights lawyer. They didn't have curriculum. You went to law school. I mean, one of the reasons I decided as a teenager that I didn't know what I wanted to be, but I knew what I didn't want to be. And I wasn't going to go to law school, because going to law school put you on a track which is not the track I wanted to be on. So all these lawyers who were there, where did they come from? Well, it turned out they were all young lawyers who came out of law school, went to work for these fancy white shoe law firms, doing, as I said, estate law, banking law, corporate law, various kinds. And then Mississippi Summer happened in 1963. And believing what they believed, a lot of them went down to volunteer for a summer. And it changed their lives. And they learned things they didn't know before and had never learned in school. And they came back to New York, and they never went back to their law firms. And those were the lawyers who were working at the ACLU, at the NYCLU, when I got there. And what Fran was talking about with welfare rights, in a way I never understood at the time, I learned all of that as a teenager at that camp for blind and deafblind adults. Why? Because most of the people who were there were poor. A lot of them came from the poorest sections in New York, from Bed-Stuy, from Harlem, and a lot of them were subsisting on welfare. And I learned things from them in the anecdotes of ordinary conversation that I had never known. and one of the guys who was at Mobilization for Youth, who was running these programs that Fran was describing, was Sherman Barr. You remember Sherman, right?
I certainly do.
And Sherman, that's how I got to that camp. Sherman was a cousin of my mother's. And he once told her, you know, what is Ira doing this summer? I was 16. And she says, well, he's doing what he always does in the summer. He goes to the schoolyard and he plays ball 12 hours a day. And he said, well, it's time that he had a job. And most of my friends who were getting summer jobs were going to the Catskills and making $3,000 for the summer. And he told my mother about this camp, and everybody was saying, oh God, he's going to work in a camp with blind people. How depressing is that going to be? And, you know, so I went off there, and Sherman was the associate director working under Irving Miller at that camp. And he got very interested while, this is way before Mobilization for Youth, while we were at the camp, in these people's stories about welfare. And it turned out, and consistent with what Fran was describing before, that we heard about these tales of even the people who were on welfare, what they got depended on whether they were employed or not. So for example, if you were employed and you were a man, you got an allotment for a certain number of razor blades. But if you weren't employed, you got fewer razor blades because you didn't have to shave to go to work. And the same thing was true with menstrual napkins. I mean, I remember reacting to that when I first heard about it. Women who were employed got an allotment based on a certain number of menstrual napkins that they were thought to have needed. But if they weren't employed, they got fewer. As if it just was astonishing to me. I was learning this when I was 16, 17, 18. And Sherman, who later went to Mobilization of Youth, was learning it at the same time. And so we found out about this underworld of welfare, where people were not only not getting welfare who were entitled to it, but even those who were getting welfare in such discriminatory and conditional ways that the whole thing was really outrageous. So when Mobilization for Youth started, and Sherman left this agency, this camp agency, and went to work there, that's where the whole thing began to be systematically developed in the way that Fran described. And then, you know, all kinds of issues came up. I remember once when people were arrested. You remember how the National Welfare Rights Bail Fund started? I mean, Dick Cloward calls me up one day at the ACLU and says, all of these welfare demonstrators are getting arrested. Why are they getting arrested? Well, the strategy was to confront the system with the consequences of what would happen if people actually got what they were entitled by law to get, and it would expose the system for what it was, which was outrageous, inadequate, discriminatory, disabling, really. So the movement that Fran and Dick were involved in was a movement, and of course that was largely what George Wiley, Maya's father, was doing as head of the National Welfare Rights Organization. They were confronting the inadequacies and the discriminatory nature of the welfare system by simply organizing people to get what they were entitled by law to get. And in the course of a lot of these demonstrations, they got arrested, which is what happens when people demonstrate against injustice. The first response of the government is to stop the demonstration. So people were getting arrested, and because our bail system depends on money, poor people stay in jail, rich people get out of jail pending trials. So Dick calls me up and says, we're trying to organize a bail fund for people so we can get people to contribute money for bail that's available when these demonstrators get arrested. I said, yeah. And he said, well, the problem is these are contributions which are tax deductible, and we don't have any tax deductible organization to accept them. and to hold them for us. And he wanted to know if it was possible for the ACLU to set up an account for, a bail fund for the National Welfare Rights Organization. And I was in the practice of not providing ACLU accounts for things that were not connected to civil liberties issues. If somebody wanted to set up an account for art or music, I wasn't going to do that. That was not our mission, and I felt constrained not to set up holding accounts for anything that was not consistent with ACLU civil liberties policy. But we were against money bail, and we were for people getting what they were legally entitled to on welfare. So I went to the board and I got them to approve what Dick was asking for, and we set up a special account at the ACLU. It was money we couldn't touch, but it was an account called the National Welfare Bail Account, and money that Dick and others raised to provide bail for the demonstrators who were getting arrested went into that account. It was available as needed. So it wasn't just lawsuits. It was things like that, if you didn't find a way to solve that problem, you stymied the movement. And being part of that structure required, I used to joke that I'm not a lawyer. That's why I can think of solutions that are not litigation. If you went to the lawyer in the ACLU and said, "What can you do?" he would have heard that as, "Can you litigate this issue?" But the answer to "can you litigate the issue" is often no. So then you got to find another way to achieve the same result. And we did a lot of that kind of thing at the NYCLU and at the ACLU in those days.
And there are a lot of lessons, I think, to be learned for the contemporary movements from what we did at that time. One very simple lesson is, well, what can, comfortable middle-class people do? They're probably not going to be out in the streets with the yelling kids and so forth, but they could create a bail fund for when the kids get arrested. They could have lawyers on hand for when the kids get arrested. There are a lot of things that comfortable, somewhat timid people can do to be part of the movement. And it makes a difference because the movement is what changes American politics.
Yes, it's not the other way around. That is right. One of the things I learned from my years at the ACLU that I did not know before I came to the ACLU, when I was interested in social change, my first thought was politics. I wanted to get into politics because that's the way I learned America worked. I mean, if you wanted to exercise the levers of power in a certain direction, you had to have political power. You had to get elected to something, or you had to work for somebody who got elected to something. And that's what I thought I wanted to be on the track to do. And that's why initially, when I was first offered the job at the New York Civil Liberties Union, I was inclined not to take it because I saw it as, lawyers. I wasn't a lawyer. I saw it as off to the side of the route to where I wanted to go. What I learned at the ACLU was that change comes from below. It never comes from the top. It always comes from below. When I tell my grandchildren that when I first went to my first big demonstration was the March on Washington, the Martin Luther King speech march in 1963, I was 25 years old. I had never been to a demonstration in my life. I was a little apprehensive, but like tens of thousands of others, I went down there. And one of the things that struck me at the time that amazed some people, younger people, when I tell it to them now, is that there was nobody from the government speaking at that march. There was no congressman. There was no senator. There was nobody from the Kennedy White House. There was nobody from the Department of Justice. There was nobody from the government there. The only people who spoke were King, Roy Wilkins, John Lewis, and people like that. And that march took place in August of 1963 at a time when civil rights legislation seemed so unlikely, so remote, so impossible to imagine. But after that march, less than a year later, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. Where did that come from? What generated the pressure that moved the people in government who hadn't come to the march? And the pressure came from below. The organizing came from below. And people all talk about John Lewis, recently departed, as a hero, but it was not clear to most of America that he was a hero then. They were actually afraid to let him speak because he was a young firebrand. Bayard Rustin stood right behind him, and I always thought ready to grab him if he said too many, inflammatory things. The speeches that kids today in school learn about at that march that are supposed to inspire them were speeches that were seen as extreme and radical by most of America and by most of Congress. But it was that movement and the fact that 250,000 people came to Washington, whites, blacks, men, women, young, old, in an incredible outpouring of support that nobody expected. It was that kind of thing that generated the pressure that led to the Civil Rights Act being passed within the next year, which nobody would have predicted back in August of 1963.
I totally agree with that. But there was a kind of commingling of government and actions from the street, crowd actions from the street. Because, Mobilization for Youth was a government.
It was federally funded, right.
It was a government project. And it was a government project that sort of landed on the Lower East Side of New York at a time when people were really fired up.
Right.
And Mobilization for Youth, it was a government project, but it had to be responsive to the passion, the energy, the anger that was welling up in the streets. So when the March on Washington was announced, Mobilization for Youth, a government project, rented a train to carry people from the Lower East Side to Washington, D.C. But ultimately, it is the movement that makes it possible for what would otherwise be a kind of regulated and staid social agency to do what movements do.
You're absolutely right. What was required was a government that was ready to be responsive to that pressure from below. If you had exactly the same thing happen, and Donald Trump was in office, there would have been tear gas and troops and arrests, and nothing ever, would have been the opposite. The Kennedy administration was ready for this, and Bobby Kennedy in particular was ready for it. And Lyndon Johnson, after Kennedy, a few months after that march was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson was ready for it. And had he not gotten bogged down in the quicksands of Vietnam and this irrational commitment to that war that he had, he would be remembered as one of our greatest presidents, because without Johnson, that Civil Rights Act in 1964 would likely have passed. So you had to have a government, you always have to have a government that's ready to be responsive to the pressure, or else you just end up in a street war. But without the pressure, the government, even if it was responsive, would not have initiated those changes by itself.
And the government is responding not only to the movement, but to electoral pressure.
Right.
So that, what all activists are kind of constantly discussing, the question of which is more effective, movement action or electoral work. and each feeds the other, each nourishes the other. That's the lesson from the past, and it's the lesson from our very immediate past as well.
Yeah.
In the 3 or 4 minutes we still have, I'd love for both of you to comment on where the movement is right now and what actions you think might be necessary, and even also talk perhaps about Reverend Barber, fusion politics and poor people's movement, and what possibilities might be happening with that movement.
You know, we're at a very difficult moment because usually when movements plan their future, they plan it in relation to a history which they think they can see unfolding. They think they can plan the future. It's very difficult in the United States today to think what is the future going to be like. In fact, you don't know what Christmas is going to be like. So it's a problem, but I think it's a problem we can overcome if we keep in mind a couple of things. One is that we do have to do electoral work. We have to recover and rebuild a Democratic Party, capital D now, a Democratic Party that sees itself as the voice and the leader of a working class constituency. That Democratic Party was ripped away from a popular constituency by the rise of the DLC, the rise of the
By
new
Bill Clinton.
What?
By Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton, and a lot of his friends too, not just Galston. There were a lot of people involved in that catastrophe, really. So what people like AOC are doing, what the squad is doing, is really very important, very important. But at the same time, there is this movement which is so big. It's, some people say it's the biggest movement in American history. It's hard to know because it's hard to measure a movement, but it is big and it is interracial and it penetrates into every small town. I now am in upstate New York. The town I'm closest to has maybe 2,000 people. You know, we have little demonstrations in front of the post office for Black Lives Matter. And this is Trump country. Nevertheless, there is a Black Lives Matter demonstration. So it's a very potent and important moment in American political development. And we have to make the most of it, because if we don't know what's going to happen, but it's not going to be good.
Your thoughts also on this, just in the last minute or so we have, Ira.
Well, I think, you know, I come out of a white working class background. My father was a construction worker in New York City who never was in school past the 5th grade. And I knew all of his buddies. I knew all of his family. I knew all of his friends in the union. I think I understand. I mean, these were people who felt salvaged by the New Deal. They worshiped Franklin Delano Roosevelt for that reason, literally. And what happened during the Clinton administration was that they abandoned these people. And those people were not particularly liberals. A lot of them harbored racial bigotry feelings. They harbored misogynic feelings. They were against gay people. They benefited from the exclusion of Blacks from their unions. They benefited from the exclusion of women. They were not liberals in the way in which you understand, the liberal left today. But all of that was submerged by their reliance on the Democratic Party to be responsive to their economic circumstances. When the Clinton administration abandoned the New Deal and began to move to what it called the center. Now, you can't move to the center unless you move to the right. That's how you get to the center. Those people became unmoored from the economic salvation that the Democratic Party represented. And once they were unmoored from that, their bigotry and their misogyny and their homophobic tendencies, which were always there, came out,
went to
surfaced, and became manipulated by the Republicans. And that's the story of our politics today. And that's why the Democratic Party has to move not only toward racial justice and gender justice and all the other disinherited people that require their support. They must move back toward the economic interests of the white working class, or the politics is going to tear us apart.
And we've got to leave it there. We could go on. I thank you both so very, very much. This has been really fascinating and very important discussion. Wish you all the best of everything, and we hope to do this again real soon. Thank you very much for watching us this week on the Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos, and we'll see you again next week on the Radical Imagination. And thank you so much, Fran and Ira, for a terrific, terrific show.